Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Finally Feel Free event. Today, I have such a special guest, Ronald Siegel, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, where he's taught for over 35 years, a longtime student of mindfulness meditation. He serves on the board of directors and faculty of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, and the faculties of the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion at the Cambridge Health Alliance, and the University of Massachusetts. I never can say that right. Massachusetts Medical School. He teaches internationally about mind-body medicine and the application of mindfulness and compassion practices in psychotherapy and other fields. His clinical career has included working with low-income children and families, treating adults with chronic pain and other stress-related disorders, and providing mindfulness-orientated psychotherapy. He currently maintains a limited private clinical practice in Lincoln, and along with his colleagues, he's also an author of 12 books, including Mindfulness and Psychotherapy, the second edition, The Mindfulness Solution, Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems, and also his brand new book, which we are going to talk about today, The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are. Ronald, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. And I am so excited about just knowing about this new book that you've written. I know we kind of touched on a little bit about it before we started, but just can you give us a little intro to that book?
Sure. Maybe the origin story is a good place to begin.
Yeah.
Because the idea for the book was born several years ago when I was already in my 60s, having worked for decades as a clinical psychologist and having been involved in mindfulness practices, mostly in a Buddhist tradition, ever since I was a kid. And you would think that at least one result of all of this effort would be to have established something like a coherent, secure, stable sense of self. But if I were honest with myself, and I was trying to be honest with myself, I realized nothing of the sort had actually occurred. Rather, my feelings about myself would regularly fluctuate, maybe not as badly as they did when I was 13 years old, but still considerable fluctuations. I'd be doing clinical work and I'd have a good session that felt meaningful and engaging and useful to my client. And I think all these years of study and practice, they've really helped to hone this instrument of me into a very competent professional. And I'd feel good about myself. And then the next hour would come and we'd be talking about a problem that was kind of remarkably reminiscent of a problem we talked about years ago. And I'd feel, gosh, I haven't been much use here at all. This is clearly not my calling. I was a bright guy. I could have gone into so many fields, and I'd start to tank. And realizing that this was constantly happening, almost every email would either make me feel a little better about myself. Oh, somebody wants me to speak at a prestigious conference, or a little worse about myself. Oh, my colleagues are speaking and I'm not there. And I started thinking, what's up with this? Is this just my personal failure that I'm going up and down in this way? Is it just because I, got picked last for the kickball team in the third grade and had some girlfriends reject me along the way? Or is there something more universal about this? And so I decided to investigate. And I dug into the literature on evolutionary psychology, which is really the study of how our brains came to be configured the way that they are. And I started looking at the literature on self-esteem and realizing that, gosh, all the scholars who've ever looked at self-esteem have come to the conclusion that trying to improve your self-esteem ultimately ends in disaster. That even though we've had programs for this and psychologists are quite guilty of having promoted this in the schools and the like, pegging our well-being on our self-esteem is actually not a very helpful project, because the way we feel good or not good about ourselves is always by comparing ourselves to others, whether implicitly or explicitly. So, for example, if I'm kind of hooked on being intelligent or feeling that I'm intelligent as a way to feel good about myself. And indeed, I've been hooked on that ever since I was a little kid. If that's my go-to place to feel good about myself, or even my addiction, then I'm implicitly comparing myself to other people that I'm thinking are more intelligent or less intelligent than I am. And the same is true if I feel good about myself for being physically fit, if I feel good about myself for being kind or generous. I'm sorry, I'm going to pause for a second. Do you hear the bell ringing? I didn't. So if I feel good about myself for being intelligent, and that's something I've relied on ever since I was a little kid, implicitly, I'm making a comparison between myself and others. If I'm feeling intelligent, I'm thinking that, well, I'm more intelligent than this other person. Or if I'm feeling unintelligent, I'm thinking that the other is more intelligent than me. And the same is true for whatever we use as the building blocks for our self-esteem. If it's I'm in good shape physically, I'm athletic, well, I'm comparing myself to others. If I think that I'm a kind person, I'm comparing myself to others who are less kind, generous, same thing. Whatever it is, it's always based on social comparison. So digging into the science behind this further, I came to realize that, wow, this is actually part of a very hardwired system in almost all social creatures, particularly mammals. You may have, seen the nature movies or even had the privilege of going on a so-called safari in Africa. And, what the naturalists point out is, there's a dominant male surrounded by literally a harem of reproductively promising females. And over in the next field, there's a group of usually younger males doing the species-specific equivalent of playing basketball or football, trying to come up with the skills to become dominant. And there are species of crickets that if you put them in a box, inside of a few seconds, they organize themselves into dominance hierarchies. And little kids, social scientists study this all the time, little kids very quickly organize themselves by dominance. Like, who's the boss of the group at age 4. So we see this, and, it just takes a moment's glance looking across societies to see all the status symbols, right, that happen, whether it's, having the necklace with the green bells in one society, having more cows in another, or I like to fly on airplanes a lot because I do it for my work. And, like boarding at the gate for the airport, like, well, we're going to start with the first class people. Okay, they paid an ungodly amount for their for their ticket, let them go first. And then the military, okay, they've sacrificed. And the little kids with the strollers, that's practical. But then we start with the hierarchy, right? The executive platinum plus passengers board, followed by the platinum, followed by the gold, the silver. And God forbid you should be one of the 8 proletariat slinking onto the plane at the end with no status at all. So we start to see that it's baked into our DNA. And it exists cross-culturally, and it's reinforced by our cultures, so much so that many of us never even question, is this the pathway to well-being? Being on top of my game, doing well at what I do? Or might this not be the most sustainable path to well-being?
That's so interesting. And I know that everybody can relate, especially, I used to be in a creative field and I still am, but especially the creatives, the artists, the actors, the singers, the dancers, I've seen this really prevalent in them as well. And just, even professionals. So it can apply to literally everyone. And it's so interesting. It's really made me think, your question, is it the answer to well-being? Because we just assume, taking your first class example, if we were to aspire to that, then we would have more comfort, we would have more well-being, or even if we're at the top of our game, we would feel like we're at the top of our game. So, like the hierarchy, we have more power, we have more dominance. But I actually just want to know the next bit. Like, is it the answer to our well-being?
No, it isn't. In fact,
No.
it causes an unbelievable amount of suffering, because we wind up basically being in one of 2 states all the time, either feeling kind of down in the dumps that we're not quite cutting it. And it might not be competition with another person who's live and here. It could be simply comparing ourselves to some inner standard of what we're supposed to be. Gee, I was supposed to amount to something in my life, or I was supposed to, get married, or I was supposed to have children, or I was supposed, whatever it might be. We have these internalized images of who we were supposed to be, or who, and sometimes we're comparing ourselves to that and either saying, yay, here I am, I made it, or no, I'm not quite cutting it. Or it's the external comparisons. And it means that we're always stressed out. We're always either feeling bad that we're not doing enough or not being who we are, or we are winning at whatever the game is. We are feeling good about ourselves, but then we're stressed out because we've got to keep up the energy. We've got to keep doing it. And we also, one of the reasons why we absolutely can't win at this is something we might call narcissistic recalibration. Sounds like a fancy term. It simply means that our yardstick for measuring ourselves constantly changes. There's a time in most of our lives where I don't know where you grew up and whether you had this toy, but in America, a very common toy was to have these concentric kind of donuts out of plastic or wood that had a hole in the middle. And the idea was for the toddler to arrange them so they look like a cone or a Christmas tree, right? And at that moment, it's like, hey, mom, hey, dad, look, I did it. And we feel very good about ourselves, or the first time riding a bike, or going to the store alone, or whatever it is, and our first boyfriend or girlfriend, our first job, maybe our first apartment or car, all of these things, they really float our boat. And I do workshops a lot, training. A lot of what I do is train other mental health professionals, and mental health professionals work pretty hard to get their terminal degrees, typically, maybe, a decade or so to do this. And at the moment that we get those degrees, we feel pretty good about ourselves. Hey, look, I did it. And I asked people, so how many of you woke up this morning? Just raise your hand if you woke up this morning feeling pretty good about yourself because you have your degree and your license. And, everybody starts laughing. Right. It's like, and sometimes there's one newly minted therapist, raising their hand saying, why is everybody laughing? Because we habituate to whatever the level is. And then we start comparing ourselves to others. I've had the privilege of, writing books and being on a speaking circuit among mental health professionals and with the general public. But I wind up comparing myself to other people who are doing that. And then I wind up feeling either, hey, I'm doing well, or not so well, because my measuring stick has changed. My peer group has changed. And we see this in terms of our job, how much we're being paid. So many different things are subject to this kind of comparison where whatever once worked no longer works. And the other thing that makes this unsustainable and makes this so not work well for us is we could think of this as the Newtonian principle. What goes up comes down, right? From Isaac Newton and gravity, right? So let's say we're so at the top of our game that we're an Olympic athlete and we've won the gold. What are the chances of winning the gold again in 4 years, in 8 years, in 12 years? So, this is why this is so unsustainable for us. And yet, because we get so much social messaging suggesting, if only we were better, if only we were more popular, if only we had more followers on Instagram, if only we had a better job title, if only we had more friends, if only we weighed 5 pounds less, whatever the thing is, we get addicted to this stuff because temporarily it feels good. But then we recalibrate, things go up and down, and it's simply not that sustainable. But sadly, we keep trying.
And also, when we do reach a certain level, we might be amongst other people at that level, and then we'll look at, how to be like, we can always, especially in this kind of personal development field, when everything is about being better and better, it's like, it's just this never ending cycle. And, as you say, if you've achieved something and then you can't really achieve that again, it's going to just feel like the rest of your life is debilitating. So what is the answer? How do we kind of, obviously life is about evolving, going forward. and reaching certain heights, but how do we also look after our well-being in the process?
Right. Well, the really good news is we also have other instincts that can help us out, right? We've got this instinct towards self-esteem, preoccupation, and how we doing. We also have instincts toward cooperation, toward connection, and we have the capacity for spiritual awakening. We have the capacity to actually notice that we're not a separate individual just competing with the other individuals, but we're part of the human family and that we're part of a much larger ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So the pathway to these alternative, more sustainable avenues to well-being, it starts with just noticing how addicted we are to the self-esteem stuff. It starts with a kind of mindfulness practice, which means simply paying attention moment to moment to thoughts and feelings as they arise, paying attention in each of our conversations with another person. How often do we enter into a conversation with another person and find ourselves feeling a little less good because they're telling us about something wonderful that's happening in their life, but it's not happening in our life, right? How often do we enter into a conversation kind of proud and feeling like good about sharing our accomplishment because we feel like we've done something that the other hasn't, or that we're good in some way. So it starts by simply watching what happens each time we open an email. Is this good news that's going to make me feel good about me, or is this bad news? And watching what happens on social media, watching what happens when we get likes, right? Every time we get a like on social media or a follower on Twitter, now X, or any of these indicators that people are interested in us, there's a little squirt of dopamine in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is our reward center. And it's the same place where there's activation when we win at gambling, or take cocaine, or do any one of a number of things that can make us feel, hey, look at me, I'm okay now, I'm pretty good now. And we can start to notice the addiction to social media, right, in which we're looking for that. And we're fearing the moments in which we get disappointed, but we get disappointed and then we check again a couple of hours later. Well, maybe it got better, because we so want that positive reinforcement and that good feeling. So it starts by noticing it. And then the second big move we can make is relationally, because when we're in an open and honest connection with another human being, this stuff starts to fall away. When we're with a good friend and we're sharing our vulnerabilities, we're sharing our joys and sorrows, we're sharing what's wonderful and difficult about life, and we're really not posturing, we're really not trying to look special, we're really fine just being ordinary, and they are doing the same. Our whole sense of self shifts. We shift from being me, worried about me, to being part of a we, and to enjoying the connection. So one of the themes in the book, which I found to be so helpful, and my clients have found to be so helpful, is in every one of our interactions, can we make a connection rather than an impression? Not just at the job interview or just when meeting the future in-laws, but anybody. The person checking us out at the checkout line, the friend who's calling, the colleague that we're working on a project with. Can we make a connection rather than an impression, and sort of deliberately shift this from trying to feel good about ourselves by in some way reinforcing or boosting our self-esteem, to letting that go and paying attention to connection?
It's so interesting you say that, because even before you said this, I felt recently that's something that you started bringing into my own life. And actually, when you genuinely just make a connection with somebody and you really have an amazing conversation, or like that depth, that meaningful interaction, you kind of end up making an impression on each other anyway, because you've shared that moment and you've been really from your heart space and really genuine. So it's so like miles apart from walking in a very superficial way and making an impression with all of the things you've done or who you are, which just never really works anyway, like when you're in a small group of people or one-to-one. So yeah, I completely agree with that for sure.
Yeah, we're impressed by the experience. It's not necessarily that we think this other person is better than other people. We
Yeah.
just totally appreciate that we can connect with them. Like how
Mm.
lovely, right?
Mm.
To be able to connect without all these things, because the problem is everything we do to try to maintain our self-esteem actually gets in the way of connecting
Mm.
because it makes us feel bad about our vulnerabilities and not wanting to share that. It's hard to be a human being. My feelings get hurt all the time. Or I feel bad that I've hurt someone else's feelings, or that life's complicated and life is difficult, and we grow old and we die, right? That everything's impermanent. That's a rough one
Mm.
too. I can testify as an old guy, where, seeing the signs of this in my peers, that's a huge challenge. And that's a challenge that everybody is facing. So, this kind of learning to connect instead is super helpful.
Mm.
And there are other things that also work. One of them is just reflecting on how we got hooked on whatever we're hooked on. We can do something called a self-esteem autobiography, which is an exercise in the book, which is to go back to our very earliest memory of either feeling good about ourselves and proud, or bad about ourselves and inadequate. For example, for me, I alluded to this. One of my earliest memories was using some kind of big or sophisticated word, and my father, who was a teacher, he lit up. I could see that mattered to him, and it registered to me that, this is good. This somehow, Ronnie's good now, right? This, I can connect to the feeling even today.
Mm.
And contrasting that to, say, going off to nursery school, I remember, and bringing, it was my birthday, and bringing one of these strings of lollipops where they're connected by the cellophane. So happy to share this special day with my classmates. And the teacher said, we're a healthy nursery school. We don't eat that kind of junk here. And going home, feeling deflated and ashamed and not good enough, and all of that. So just as an example of where we can start these autobiographies, and then throughout our whole lives, my God, the thousands of moments, right, where we either got to feel good and proud and either liked or respected or lovable or valued, and all the moments where we felt, rejected or not good enough or not living up to some expectation. And we really start to see what the building blocks have been. And then we can ask ourselves all sorts of really interesting questions, like, what's the grading system I use to feel good about myself? Is it like how good I was in the last week or the last month? Is it a cumulative GPA, like since I was born? How do I think of myself as good enough or not good enough? And we start to see how crazy and arbitrary these systems are. Powerful, but quite crazy and quite arbitrary. And that helps to free us a bit. And then there's tools from positive psychology that are so useful, which is simply practicing gratitude. Any moment that we can be grateful for what we have in this moment, whether it's a difficult moment or a lovely moment, is a moment in which we're grateful toward or for something. So we're kind of connected to something other than ourselves. And instead of doubling down on the desire, if only I could have this, then I'd be okay, we start to actually notice what we already have. And that can be quite ordinary. Like, hey, woke up this morning. That won't always be so. That's pretty good. That's pretty cool. And these kinds of things can start to shift our system so that we're not, so that we step out of the addictive loops and start to savor the wonderful, simple, and quite ordinary moments in our lives.
And I know that there's also this kind of culture of, like, with age, like the older you get, the more depending on what you feel like you've achieved in your life, or if you've hit certain milestones that everybody else is seeming to hit, you can start feeling quite like just not celebrating that you're growing older. So what would you kind of, and obviously that is conditioned, but what would you say to somebody who's feeling like that?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting because, there are cultures that value and honor age and associate it with wisdom. There's a lot of cultures that don't, and see it as, hey, you use your smartphone with an index finger instead of with your thumbs, you're obviously completely incompetent as a human being, right? So there has actually been a fair amount of study in psychology about aging and wisdom. And much of it tries to address the really interesting question, which is, do we get wiser as we get older? And the answer from research studies is it depends. Some people become wiser as they become older. They have more perspective. They let go of these kinds of self-esteem preoccupations, and they start valuing connection much more because this is part of wisdom. And they start to think a lot more about, what are the consequences of my actions in the short term and the long term for those close to me and for the wider world? They have this kind of big picture view. And other people just double down on their defenses, and they get narrower, and they brag more about what they did in their youth, and they cling to things that are fading and disappearing, and they suffer terribly as a result. And interestingly, a big variable as to whether we're going to get wiser with each year or more entrenched in our defenses and coping strategies each year seems to be whether we have the intention to grow wiser each year. So, and this is good news for people who are listening to your podcast, which tends to offer advice in terms of psychological or spiritual development. Yeah, actually attending to psychological and spiritual development as though that is worthwhile and that is a meaningful place to be putting our energies, as opposed to, let me try to get a good feeling by winning at something right now. Which isn't to say don't achieve and don't, use your skills. It's just about getting attached to that and seeing that as the pathway to well-being, as opposed to seeing, connection, making a genuine contribution, gratitude, and these kinds of things as the pathway. So we can do that, and we can start to get at that. Everybody's heading in the same place. The image from the nursing home of the person drooling in the wheelchair. Sorry, this is tough, but this is real. And the person saying, oh yeah, she was a well-known nuclear physicist when she was younger. This is real. This is real. This is the nature of reality. And the sooner we start to get that, the more we're going to enjoy and find happiness in our life at whatever stage we're at.
And it's also kind of like not competing with ourselves as well, because if we reach something and it's not to kind of top that, like spend the rest of our life trying to, reach the next thing. So yeah, so much food for thought.
Yeah, totally. I have a good friend and colleague, very, very successful as a psychologist, wrote many books and was on a lot of presentations circuits. And, he had this moment, this will date us all, but in which, he appeared on Oprah, right? To talk about one of his books, which back in the day was a really big deal, right? Before we had influencers on TikTok. And, but, what do you do after that? Right. And exactly what you're talking about. Then I started to feel like, well, everything else, I'm not quite, there anymore.
Yeah, because I definitely work with a lot of people that are super successful, but just feel like, what's next?
Yeah.
I've done everything. I've got the house, I've got the marriage, I've got the kids, I've got the biggest success, but it can actually, in some people, leave them feeling a little bit like empty because they've spent their whole life chasing these other things that have given them significance and status. But the part you're talking about, which is connecting with themselves, like their true self, the mindfulness, connecting with others, connecting with nature, spirituality, and that's kind of I think it just sums up what this whole event is about, to be honest, which is connecting with those three things.
And the tremendous humility that comes with this, really getting it that, you know, you know, one person may, found, Amazon, another may start Google, and we're all human beings here.
Yeah.
It actually is true. And you see the folly, sorry, this will sound a little critical, of, the multi-billionaires competing for whose private rocket can go higher. And you start to think, wait a minute, still same thing as was happening on, for kickball in the third grade. Really?
Mm.
Is there no, at whatever moment we are in our lives,
Mm.
looking for a way to embrace and celebrate our ordinariness, and really start to step off of these kind of addictive uh, self-esteem pursuits, can bring tremendous joy.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ronald, for this conversation, your expertise and your wisdom. We will link all your links down below. Your book, The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are, and also your other links to any free gifts, your newsletter, your podcast, all of that kind of stuff.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Hello, Soul Family. I really hope this interview helped you to finally feel free. Remember, it's not too late to be part of the VIP Sacred Circle, and at 99% off, I'm super excited to invite you to lifetime access to all the interviews and the complete event schedule so you can customize your viewing experience. You get an exclusive all-access gift pass, which means you can dive straight into the virtual goodie bag of gifts right now. You get a private one-to-one future projection session with me, where together we will craft and connect with your highest timeline 5D quantum future self. You also get a transformative month in the Sacred Soul Experience Mastermind, where we break through constraints of time and take leaps in health, love, wealth, and spiritual alignment. You receive laser coaching for your questions and create breakthroughs in your personal journey. This offering is here for you for just $99, and my intention is to support you wholeheartedly on your journey towards inner freedom, conscious love, and celestial connection. Act quick. This is a time-sensitive offer and will be updated after a certain date. So much love.